Her hands trembled as she smoothed her scrubs outside the pediatric ICU at Seattle General in Raleigh. 3 weeks of hospital corridors had worn grooves into her composure, and she needed to press it back into place before walking through those doors. Katie Rodriguez stood motionless for 7 seconds, watching her reflection in the glass panel, a 34-year-old woman in pale blue scrubs who looked like every other nurse in this building. Nobody looking at her would see the field thoracotomy scars on her hands, earned with a combat knife at 14,000 feet above the Hindu Kush. Nobody would see the tiny faded patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the 455th Expeditionary Wing insignia that she touched every morning like a rosary before her shift began. Dr. Pierce saw only trembling hands. He stood near the medication dispensary 20 feet away, watching her through the glass partition of pediatric ICU room for 12. His posture suggested casual interest, the kind of pose an attending physician might hold while reviewing charts, but Katie had learned to read the tells. His jaw was clenched. His eyes followed her movement with the intensity of a predator watching prey. She had been at Seattle General for 14 months, working the night and swing shifts, keeping her head low and her badge lanyard visible. 14 months of invisibility. 14 months of not drawing attention. And then Marcus Webb arrived. The boy lay motionless beneath a woven blanket, his small skull wrapped in surgical bandaging that made him look ancient, hollowed out. 9 years old. 3 weeks since the car accident on I-40 when his mother didn't see the red light. She had died on impact. Marcus had not woken up since. Katie moved into the room with the quiet precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times before, not as a nurse in a civilian hospital, but in a field station 30 kilometers from forward operating base Shank, where the wounded arrived wrapped in blood-soaked uniforms and the first 72 hours determine everything. She checked the ventilator settings first. The hiss of air escaping the cuff was steady, rhythmic, normal. Then the 4 lines. 4 of them. Too many. Then the monitors. Heart rate 68. Oxygen saturation 96%. Blood pressure 114/67. All stable. All drugged to a point where stability meant nothing because it meant the boy beneath the bandages wasn't there anymore. She adjusted his blanket with her left hand and caught sight of something on his forearm. Just below the 4 line. A tattoo. Small. Faded. Letters she couldn't quite read from this distance. Katie's breath caught once, a single involuntary moment, before her training reasserted itself. She leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. The letters resolved into clarity. 1 word. Shadowbird. Her call sign. The one she had carried through Bagram Airfield 2 years ago. The one she had whispered to this child in the chaos of mortar fire, holding him against her body armor as rounds tore through the buildings around them. Stay with Shadowbird. Stay with me. Don't let go. He had gripped her uniform so hard his small fingers left bruises on her arms. He didn't remember her now. His eyes stared past her, through her, into a void where consciousness had retreated to some unreachable place. Empty eyes. Unseeing. The boy's small hand lay on the mattress, and Katie resisted the impulse to take it. Protocol. Distance. The classified mission parameters that Colonel James Webb is standing vigil at his son's bedside, dress blues crisp despite 3 weeks of sleeping in hospital chairs, could never be allowed to suspect. Colonel Webb had brought Marcus to Seattle General because the surgeons here were the best in the region. He had no idea that the assignment of his family to this hospital, to this ward, to this specific moment, had been calculated by 3 different intelligence analysts at the Pentagon. He had no idea that his son's medical care had been flagged as a potential vulnerability after his recent counterterrorism work in Afghanistan had drawn attention from elements that preferred him dead. He had no idea that the quiet nurse smoothing his son's blanket every morning shift had spent the last 14 months documenting everything, visitor patterns, phone calls, the subtle ways that certain people moved through the hospital with too much purpose and not enough badge identification. Katie pulled the medication chart from the foot of the bed. Her eye scanned the dosages. Propofol running at 10 milliliters per hour. Midazolam every 4 hours. vecuronium for paralysis. All standard for a child on a ventilator. All carefully prescribed by Dr. Edmund Pierce, the pediatric ICU director, a man who had been at Seattle General for 17 years and who had never, in those 17 years, lost a single internal audit or quality control review. But the dosages were too high. Katie made a notation on the chart with the precision of someone documenting evidence. The sedation protocol was rendering Marcus not just unconscious but chemically erased. The paralytic agent meant he couldn't move, couldn't signal distress, couldn't communicate through any channel except the machines that recorded his vital signs. It was textbook over-treatment for a patient whose condition was stable. It was, Katie thought, the kind of protocol that someone might maintain if they weren't particularly invested in the patient's recovery. Nurse Rodriguez. She turned. Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway, his white coat expensive, tailored, the kind that cost more than Katie's monthly rent. He carried a coffee from the cafeteria, the cup adorned with the hospital logo. His smile was the smile of a man who had never experienced consequences. A word. Katie touched the inside of her jacket once, briefly, feeling the faded unit patch against her ribs. Then she set the chart down with deliberate care and moved toward the doorway. Colonel Webb glanced up from his vigil but said nothing. He had learned not to interrupt his son's care. He had learned to sit quietly and trust the professionals. He had no idea his trust was being evaluated by a woman whose real job began the moment she walked out of this hospital. The corridor outside the ICU smelled like disinfectant and desperation, the particular combination of floor wax and human grief that lived in every pediatric ward in America. Dr. Pierce positioned himself between Katie and the nursing station, blocking her return path with his body. Not physically blocking. Just standing in the way, the kind of men stand in the way when they want to remind someone of their place in the hierarchy. "I've noticed you reviewing the charts rather thoroughly," he said. His voice had the texture of authority wrapped in velvet, the kind of tone that made young nurses second-guess themselves. More thoroughly than one would expect from someone with your level of experience. Katie's hands remained still. Her jaw did not clench. She had learned composure in places where the alternative was death, and this man was merely an irritation. "The chart is available to all nursing staff." "Of course it is." He took a sip of coffee. The steam curled between them. "But I've noticed that you seem particularly interested in the medication protocols. The sedation dosages, specifically. I wonder why that might be." Katie's voice, when she spoke, was quiet. Deferential. Ensuring accuracy. "That's all." "Just a nurse making sure nothing was missed," he said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he already knew the answer to questions he hadn't asked yet. "I appreciate that kind of diligence, Katie. It's the mark of someone who cares. But it also borders on stepping outside your scope of practice." He paused. "You understand the distinction, I'm sure." "Yes, Doctor." "Good." He smiled again, and this time it reached his eyes. It was the smile of a man who had just established territory. Because if there's one thing this hospital doesn't tolerate, it's nurses who develop opinions about treatments they're not qualified to evaluate. He walked away before she could respond. Katie stood in the corridor, listening to his footsteps fade toward the administrative wing. The fluorescent lights hummed above her like cicadas. Somewhere down the hall, an alarm began its insistent beeping, a low oxygen alert, a falling heart rate, the mechanical language of crisis that no one was rushing to answer. Not yet. Not with enough urgency. Katie filed that sound away alongside everything else she had filed away since she arrived at Seattle General 14 months ago. She turned back toward room 412. Colonel Webb was still sitting in the bedside chair, his hand wrapped around his son's small fingers. The hand of a man who had given orders that saved lives and orders that took them. The hand of a man who had no idea that his entire family was under surveillance by the woman who had once pulled his son from rubble and carried him toward the medevac landing zone while mortars exploded 30 meters away. Marcus Webb's eyes remained empty, unseeing, unaware that the person standing in his doorway was the only person in this hospital who knew what he had been before the accident. Before the darkness. before everyone decided that a 9-year-old boy was better off sedated into oblivion than forced to confront whatever was broken inside his small skull. Katie pulled on a fresh pair of gloves and began her rounds. Room by room. Patient by patient. The invisible woman in pale blue scrubs moving through the corridors like someone who belonged there, which, technically, she did. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Pierce knew exactly what she was looking for. And he was already preparing to make sure she never found it. Morning rounds began at 8:16 a.m., and Dr. Pierce moved through the pediatric ICU like a general surveying conquered territory. 7 residents and 4 specialists trailed behind him in a surgical procession, their white coats rustling as they entered Marcus Webb's room. Katie stood at the bedside, adjusting the boy's position with the kind of precision that prevented bedsores, the small mercies that no one noticed. Marcus lay motionless, ventilator tube taped to his mouth, his 9-year-old frame swallowed by the hospital bed. Colonel Webb sat rigid in the plastic chair beside his son, hand resting on the blanket. Dr. Pierce stopped at the foot of the bed and smiled. It wasn't a smile that reached his eyes. It was the smile of a man about to demonstrate his dominance. "Nurse Rodriguez," he announced loudly enough for all 11 people in the room to hear, "please explain to our colleagues why you've taken it upon yourself to document concerns about the sedation protocol I personally designed for traumatic brain injury patients." Katie's fingers stilled on Marcus's shoulder. She took one measured breath before speaking. "The current dosage may be masking neurological responses we need to assess for accurate prognosis evaluation." Dr. Pierce turned to the residents and smiled wider. "Florence Nightingale here believes she understands pediatric neurology better than the consensus of 15 doctors who have examined this child." 15, Nurse Rodriguez. Not 1. Not 5. 15. He gestured toward the monitors. "These physicians have reached unanimous agreement about Marcus's prognosis. We're managing his comfort in his final days." Katie's jaw tightened but her voice remained level. The kind of level that came from military discipline, from standing at attention while officers made decisions, from learning that silence was sometimes the only power you had left. "I'm suggesting we reduce sedation for a brief neurological assessment. If we could observe his..." "You're demonstrating exactly why nurses follow orders rather than give them." Dr. Pierce cut her off, his voice sharp enough to draw blood. He turned to Colonel Webb. "I apologize, Colonel, that you have to witness this kind of enthusiasm from staff who fundamentally don't understand their scope of practice." Colonel Webb's jaw clenched. His eyes moved from Dr. Pierce to Katie and back again, something unreadable flickering across his face, recognition, maybe, or suspicion. The kind of look a military man gives when something doesn't add up. Katie met Dr. Pierce's gaze without flinching. One tear escaped down her left cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact, without turning away, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing her retreat. The tears weren't weakness, they were her body's rebellion against control, against watching a 9-year-old boy disappear into sedation that served no medical purpose. Her hands remained steady. "Dismissed, Nurse Rodriguez," Dr. Pierce said quietly. She left the room without acknowledgement. Behind her, she heard Colonel Webb ask Dr. Pierce a question about prognosis. The answer came in careful, measured language that revealed nothing. By noon, the disciplinary write-up was posted on the public board outside the nurses' station where anyone could see it. White paper. Official letterhead. Her name in Dr. Pierce's handwriting, N. Rodriguez, written warning, insubordination and exceeding scope of practice, date, today. The words were printed clearly enough that patients walking past could read them. That families could read them. The humiliation was the point. The point was to make sure everyone saw that Dr. Pierce had identified a problem and solved it. The point was to make her untouchable. Katie stood in front of the board for exactly 4 seconds. She didn't crumple the paper. She didn't take it down. She simply read it, committed his handwriting to memory, and walked to the break room. The break room at Seattle General smelled like stale coffee and something else, the particular stench of fluorescent-lit despair that accumulates in rooms where healthcare workers pretend to rest. 6 nurses sat at the center table, their lunch trays arranged in a small fortress of camaraderie. Katie recognized all of them. She'd covered shifts for 3 of them. She'd helped 2 others train new protocols. She'd listened to one complain about her daughter's dance recital for 40 minutes while they reorganized the medication cart. They didn't acknowledge her. They simply began gathering their trays the moment she sat down with her lunch. One by one, they left, not rushing, not obviously fleeing, just leaving. Making room. Creating distance. Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching to make sure everyone understood the lesson. His presence was a command. His posture was an announcement. He didn't need to speak. He only needed to stand there. Katie sat alone at the empty table. The chair beside her was conspicuously vacant, as if someone had erased the possibility of companionship from this space. She opened her container, turkey sandwich, apple, water bottle, and ate mechanically. The food had no taste. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing remained steady. This was tactical. This was expected. The isolation was meant to break her, but it had already broken her once before, in a combat hospital outside Bagram where she'd learned to function completely alone if that's what survival required. Through the break room window, she watched Dr. Pierce approach the disciplinary board in the hallway. He produced a pen and added something else beneath her name. She couldn't read it from this distance, but she didn't need to. She already knew what it said. She already understood that he was documenting everything, building a case, preparing the narrative that would explain why a nurse named Rodriguez needed to be removed from this hospital entirely. That afternoon, Katie found herself in the supply room on the 3rd floor, ostensibly checking inventory. Actually, she was accessing the secured computer terminal hidden behind the locked cabinet, the one that required a 4-digit code that the evening shift supervisor had mentioned months ago without realizing she'd heard it. The one that connected directly to pharmaceutical ordering and billing records. Marcus's chart appeared on screen. The medications prescribed were extensive. The medications administered were far fewer. Someone was ordering 3 times the volume needed for his care. 2 units of a proprietary sedative blend called Nurex 12, which wasn't FDA approved but had emergency compassionate use authorization stamped on every order form. The supplier was a company called Precision Neurosolutions, registered in Delaware, with a physical address that led nowhere. The name on the authorization line was Dr. M. Pierce. The billing codes, she traced them carefully, showed charges to Tricare, the military health insurance system. Thousands of dollars per day for a 9-year-old child. Katie photographed 3 pages with her phone. Her hands moved with the precision of someone gathering evidence, someone building a file, someone who had been trained to document war crimes and present them to command. Her military brain kicked in automatically. Gather information. Photograph everything. Don't leave traces. The door opened. Dr. Pierce stood silhouetted against the harsh hallway light behind him, his figure reduced to a dark shape, a void in the form of a man. His voice came from that darkness, casual and cold. Looking for something, Nightingale? Katie didn't turn around. She closed the screen and stood slowly. When she faced him, her expression was blank. Professional. The face of a nurse caught doing something slightly beyond her job description, not the face of someone who had just photographed evidence of his fraud. Inventory check. Medications are running low on several items. Dr. Pierce stepped into the supply room. He didn't close the door behind him. He wanted witnesses available if he needed them. I noticed your badge didn't access the ICU this morning. Strange, for someone so concerned about a particular patient. He smiled. I changed your access parameters. Conflict of interest. You're reassigned to post-surgical recovery, effective immediately. Katie's pulse remained steady. Understood, sir. I also called Administrator Chen. Documented your behavioral pattern. The insubordination. The way you questioned my medical judgment in front of colleagues. The way you've made Colonel Webb uncomfortable with your attention to his son's case. Dr. Pierce stepped closer. His cologne was expensive, something that smelled like leather and arrogance. 11 years nursing? That's a solid career. Be ashamed to lose it over a misunderstanding about scope of practice. Katie didn't respond. She simply moved past him toward the door. Behind her, Dr. Pierce's voice followed. By the way, I'm recommending that you receive additional supervision. Someone will be reviewing your charts, your orders, your patient interactions. All of them. Consider it professional development. She didn't look back. Her hands, which could have broken his collarbone in 4 separate places, remained at her sides. Her breathing, which could have shifted into tactical patterns learned in combat zones, remained even. Her face showed nothing. Not fear. Not anger. Not the fury of someone watching a 9-year-old boy being poisoned while the poisoner walked free. That evening, Katie's patient roster changed. The 11 names she'd been monitoring for weeks, familiar cases, patients she'd bonded with, people she'd advocated for, disappeared from her assignment board. In their place, post-surgical recovery patients she'd never met. Fresh appendectomies. Recent knee replacements. People whose care required nothing from her except basic vitals and comfort measures. The message was clear. Contain her. Neutralize her. Make sure she has no access to anything that might matter. At 9:15 p.m., standing at the nurse's station, Katie overheard Dr. Pierce on the phone with someone he called Administrator Chen. His voice was smooth, concerned, the voice of a professional managing an HR problem. Yes, multiple instances of overstepping, confrontational with senior physicians, the family has expressed concerns about her behavior around the patient. I think it's best we document everything carefully. He paused, listening. Of course. I'll send the incident reports through official channels. Through the ICU window, Katie could see Marcus's bed from the hallway. 30 feet away. Close enough to see the monitors. Too far to reach him. The intracranial pressure readings climbed steadily, not a crisis yet, but trending in the wrong direction. Someone should reduce his sedation to clear his system. Someone should order neuroimaging to check for secondary bleeding. Someone should be doing something other than watching him disappear into chemical fog while the pharmaceutical orders kept coming. Katie approached the charge nurse, a woman named Susan who had worked at Seattle General for 17 years and had learned that survival meant not making waves. Marcus Webb's ICP is elevated. The trend has been climbing for 4 hours. Someone should. Dr. Pierce is managing that case personally, Susan interrupted gently, not meeting her eyes. You're not assigned there anymore, Katie. You need to focus on your new patients. Katie returned to the post-surgical recovery floor, but she checked the ICU camera monitors every 20 minutes from the hallway, footage that cycled through each room, providing just enough detail to see his vitals but not enough to read the numbers precisely. At 11:48 p.m., the red alarm flashed on Marcus's screen. His ICP spiked catastrophically. The number flashing, 32. Critical. Herniation level pressure. Katie watched the on-call resident, a first year who looked approximately 16 years old, freeze at the bedside. He stood there, frozen like a statue, chart in hand, unable to move. Colonel Webb stood beside his son, gripping his hand, asking questions that the resident couldn't answer because he didn't know what he was looking at. Katie's hands stopped trembling. Not because she was calm. Because calm was irrelevant now. Because her body understood something her conscious mind was still processing, everything else was secondary. The job, the cover, the mission, the rules, all of it was a luxury she could no longer afford. She walked straight to the ICU entrance. Her badge didn't work. The reader flashed red and beeped an access denial. She tried again. Same result. But the night janitor, an older man named Rodriguez, no relation, who'd served with the 82nd Airborne and whom Katie had helped navigate the VA system for his disability paperwork, was mopping nearby. He didn't ask questions. Veterans don't ask questions when something matters. He just unlocked the door from inside. Katie entered Marcus's room. The first-year resident stammered something incoherent. Katie didn't acknowledge him. She was reading the monitors, understanding the pressure, recognizing the trajectory. 10 minutes. That was how long Marcus had before his brain tissue started to herniate irreversibly. The resident said something about authorization. Catastrophic brain bleed, Katie said quietly, her voice dropping an octave, becoming something entirely different from the deferential nurse of this morning. He needs emergency burr hole decompression or he herniates in 10 minutes. I can't authorize. Then watch. Katie prepped the site with betadine solution, her movements precise and mechanical, the kind of automatic precision that comes from muscle memory trained into your body by years of doing something under fire. She performed field thoracotomies with a combat knife outside a burning compound in Bagram airfield. She'd opened chests under mortar fire. She'd stabilized bleeding soldiers in sandstorm conditions where visibility was 20 feet and time was measured in heartbeats. A pediatric burr hole in a sterile ICU was simpler. Her hands made the incision. The scars visible now under the harsh overhead lights, old scars, the kind that tell stories of trauma and survival. Colonel Webb stared at her hands, something breaking open in his expression. "Who are you?" he whispered. Katie didn't answer. She couldn't answer. Not yet. She opened the cranium with the precision of someone who had done this exact procedure when the alternative was death. The pressure released. The monitor's shrill alarm stopped screaming. Marcus's vitals stabilized. His oxygen saturation climbed. His heart rate dropped from dangerous to merely elevated. The bleeding slowed. Katie documented everything, every second of the procedure, every intervention, every vital sign reading. She documented it perfectly, which meant that Dr. Pierce would see the timestamp and understand exactly what she'd done. He would also understand that she didn't care anymore. The cover was broken. The mission was secondary. She met Colonel Webb's eyes one final time before security would inevitably arrive. "He's stable now," she said quietly. Then she left the room, removed her badge and scrubs in the locker room, and walked out into the Raleigh night where rain hammered the parking lot like applause for something terrible and true. The rain had stopped by morning, but the parking lot still smelled like wet asphalt and diesel from the delivery trucks. Katie arrived at Seattle General at 5:24 a.m., 30 minutes before her shift, the same routine she'd maintained for 4 months. Muscle memory. Even when everything else fractures, the body remembers discipline. She swiped her badge at the pediatric ICU entrance. Nothing. The light stayed red. No click. No green indicator. She swiped again, slower this time, watching the magnetic strip slide through the reader like she could will it to work through sheer attention. The card was cool against her fingertips. Worn at the edges from exactly 4 months and 2 weeks of use. Third swipe. Red light. You don't have access to this unit anymore. The charge nurse, Patricia, didn't look up from her desk. Her voice carried the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been forced to deliver bad news before breakfast. Dr. Pierce removed your authorization last night. You're reassigned to post-op and ortho starting today. Katie held her badge in her palm. Studied the small photograph, taken on day 1, hair pulled back, eyes level with the camera. Just a nurse. What about my current patients? Her voice stayed flat. Professional. The way you ask about the weather. Transferred. All of them. Your roster is cleared as of 2,300 hours. Patricia finally glanced up. She looked away again almost immediately. I'm sorry. I don't make these decisions. Katie nodded once. Turned. Walked away without response. The right move. The only move. Show no reaction, no anger, no confusion. Don't give him the satisfaction of watching it land. But it had landed. Marcus was reassigned. That meant Marcus was unmonitored except by Dr. Pierce's protocols. Those pharmaceutical orders, the oversedation, the 15 neurologists already signing off on brain death based on insufficient neurological data, all of it would proceed without anyone watching. Without Katie watching. She went to the locker room instead of post-op, changed into her scrubs slowly, methodically, the way she'd been trained to move through shock. One arm through the sleeve. Pause. Breathe. Other arm. The patch inside her jacket was there when she hung it on the hook. 455th Expeditionary Wing. Faded now, the embroidery threads fraying at the edges after 2 years of being checked obsessively every shift. She'd been checking it less frequently. Trying to fade into the background so completely that no one would notice her. So that she could do her job. So that she could watch over a boy who couldn't remember her face. 40 minutes later, Katie stood outside Administrator Chen's office on the 3rd floor. Through the glass partition, she could see Dr. Pierce already seated across from Chen's desk. Papers spread between them. Incident reports, she recognized the format. 4 pages minimum, maybe 5. Her handwriting would be documented in every one. The door was closed but not locked. She didn't go in. Instead, she found the pediatric ICU again, a different entrance, a stairwell route she'd memorized in case the main corridors became hostile territory, which they had. The ICU was quieter at 6:40 a.m. The night shift was documenting, the day shift hadn't arrived yet. Marcus's room was at the end of the corridor, visible through the large window that overlooked the nursing station. Katie pulled up his chart on a public access terminal. Nurse documentation only, she had no authority to access physician notes anymore, not since the termination letter Dr. Pierce had backdated to yesterday. But the lab work was visible. The imaging studies were available to anyone with a credential badge. She opened Marcus's neurology scan from day 6 post-injury. 3-dimensional reconstruction of his brain, color-coded regions showing activity patterns. At 6 years old, a normal child's brain shows diffuse activation across cortical and subcortical regions. The anterior cingulate should light up like a neural constellation. The basal ganglia should perform their orchestration of movement and consciousness. Marcus's brain was dark. But not the way 15 neurologists had interpreted. They'd seen darkness and called it death. They'd ordered palliative care and life support withdrawal. They'd written discharge summaries and family counseling plans. Katie had seen something different in the patterns. Something that most trained radiologists would miss because they weren't looking for it in pediatric cases. Locked-in syndrome. Complete motor paralysis with preserved cognition, the consciousness trapped behind the completely disabled body like a prisoner watching through a window he cannot break. It was rare in blast trauma. It was catastrophically rare in 9-year-old children. But Katie had seen it twice in her combat rotations at Bagram. Both times in juvenile patients exposed to IED secondary blasts. Both times the initial medical assessment called it brain death. Both times the patients had regained marginal consciousness within weeks and this was the critical variable, if they weren't kept in pharmaceutical sedation that made it impossible to distinguish consciousness from neural death. Marcus had been sedated continuously for 3 weeks. The medication orders showed it. Propofol, midazolam, fentanyl pushed on rotating 12-hour schedules, way beyond what his actual physical recovery required. A 9-year-old with a scalp laceration and moderate closed head injury should be weaning off sedation by day 10. Should be opening his eyes by day 12. Should be responding to stimuli by day 14. Instead, Marcus was deeper under each day. Darker. More absent. Unless that was exactly the point. Katie looked at the billing codes attached to each medication administration. They were flagged as high-complexity pediatric critical care, which in the TRICARE military medical system generated approximately 2.3 times the reimbursement of standard ICU care. She didn't have access to supplier contracts or pharmaceutical kickback schedules. That would require hospital finance clearance she'd never possess, but she could do the math. 21 days. 3 medications per day. Standard pediatric doses legitimately needed for acute head trauma would be maybe 5 days of heavy sedation. The additional 16 days of continuous pharmaceutical paralysis? That was margin. That was profit. The doors to the stairwell opened behind her. Dr. Pierce stepped through, his shoes making that particular squeaking sound expensive leather makes when the weight shifts. His expression was calm. His posture was perfect. He looked like a man who had just won a meeting. Nurse Rodriguez. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. You're in violation of access restriction. Leave the unit. I was reviewing available data, Katie said quietly. Pediatric post-head trauma outcomes. Professional development. You were accessing a patient chart without authorization. He moved closer. Not threatening. Just present. The way a large animal moves, confident in its dominance. You're reassigned. Your badge doesn't work here. Yet you're here. At 6:45 a.m. Reading about a patient you no longer have clinical responsibility for. The patient needs evaluation, Katie said. The patient needs comfort measures. Pierce's voice didn't change pitch or volume. But something in it hardened, like metal cooling. 15 neurologists have completed their assessments. The family has been counseled. The plan is palliative care and withdrawal of life support within 72 hours unless the family requests otherwise. That's medical consensus, Nurse Rodriguez. That's the standard of care. The neurologists didn't have the proper baseline imaging to rule out locked-in syndrome. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Pierce smiled. It was a small smile. A smile that didn't touch his eyes. A smile like a wolf showing teeth and expecting no one to notice. You're not a neurologist, he said. You're not an intensivist. You're a hospital nurse with a 4-year degree and a certification exam you passed on your 3rd attempt. Do you understand the scope of your practice? Do you understand the difference between proper medical assessment and your instincts? Yes, Katie said. I understand I'm watching a child die because the medication orders don't match the clinical need. Then you understand why you've been terminated. He pulled a document from his jacket pocket. Her termination letter. Effective immediately. For violation of restricted access, unauthorized clinical intervention, and insubordination. Security will escort you from the building. Your nursing license will be reported to the State Board for review pending formal malpractice hearing. Katie felt the words settle into her chest like shrapnel. Not the impact, she'd survived worse impacts. But the precision of it. The way each clause was perfectly calculated to end her. To end her presence in this hospital. To end her ability to monitor Colonel Webb's family or intercede for the boy. I performed an emergency procedure that saved his life, she said quietly. You performed an unauthorized surgical intervention without proper credentials, without physician oversight, in direct violation of your employment agreement and your professional scope. That child is brain dead, Nurse Rodriguez. Whatever you think you accomplished it on a corpse. He turned and walked back through the stairwell door. Katie stood alone at the terminal. The screen still showed Marcus's neurology scan. The dark brain. The preserved brainstem. The patterns that told her everything she needed to know if she was looking for it. She pulled up the medication administration record for the past 21 days. Printed it silently to the secure printer 3 stations over. Folded it into her scrub pocket. Then she logged out, left the terminal, and walked to the locker room. Changed back into her civilian clothes. Checked the faded unit patch one last time before closing her jacket. The rain had started again by the time she reached the parking lot. A steady cold drizzle that darkened the asphalt and filled the spaces between her footsteps with small perfect echoes. She stood at the bus stop for 20 minutes, watching the hospital's east entrance through the downpour. Watching security walk past the windows. Watching the morning shift arrive and disperse to their assignments. Then she saw Colonel Webb walking toward pediatrics, shoulders tight, movement that spoke of a man who didn't know his son was scheduled to die in 70 hours. A man who was about to be told that the medical consensus was against him. That his child's brain was gone. That the kindest thing was to let go. Katie watched him disappear into the building. The bus arrived. She didn't board it. Instead, she turned and walked back toward the hospital's rear entrance, the one that opened into the secure corridor used by transport staff and facilities. Her badge still worked there. Small mercy. Small oversight in the termination process. Marcus's medication schedule showed the next administration at 0900 hours. Propofol and fentanyl, the combination that deepened the sedation every 12 hours. The combination that made locked-in consciousness look like brain death. 70 hours until they pulled the ventilator. She had exactly 70 hours to prove that 15 doctors were wrong. The monitor screamed at 2:48 a.m. Katie was 3 floors up in the staff locker room, changing out of scrubs that smelled like antiseptic and her own sweat, when her phone vibrated against the cold metal bench. Marcus Webb's primary ICU alarm. Then his secondary. Then the overhead page that turned her blood to ice water, code blue, pediatric ICU, bed 12. Code blue. She moved before thinking. The locker door swung shut on its own. Her bare feet hit the tile and she was running, pulling the Air Force t-shirt over her head as she moved, muscle memory from 1,000 emergency scrambles in Kandahar where you dressed and moved simultaneously or people died. Down the back stairwell. 2 flights. The fluorescent lights flickered in the corridor like they were watching. Bed 12. The on-call resident, some third-year named Castellano who looked like he'd never actually seen a critical bleed outside a simulator, stood frozen at the bedside, watching the monitor with the expression of a man watching his car sink into a lake. Just standing there. Just watching the numbers fall. 72. 68. 59. Katie grabbed the crash cart with one hand and was already assessing before her second breath. Marcus's pupils blown wide. The ventilator fighting. The CT results from 6 hours ago suddenly, hideously, clear in her mind, the subtle shift in ventricular density she'd noticed when Pierce wasn't looking. Subdural hematoma. Expanding. And now, with all that pharmaceutical suppression finally wearing off enough for his brain to wake up, the pressure was building like a bomb with a timer nobody had thought to stop. "We have to call neurosurgery," Castellano said. "They're not available until." Not available. Katie's voice didn't sound like her own voice. It sounded like someone who'd held a medevac line open with one hand and a surgical needle with the other while a Sea at 17 tore through a sandstorm at 40,000 feet. "He's herniating. Call them now. I need a burr hole kit and a 1 milliliter syringe." "You can't, you're not authorized for." O2 dropping. 53. The sound of the monitor was like a countdown timer. Like the rotor wash of a helicopter that's about to take fire. Katie had her hands moving already. The kit was in the supply cabinet where it always was. Sterile gloves snapped like gunshots against the silence. She found the surgical site on Marcus's small skull with her fingertips, the temporal region, just above the tragus, where the bone was thinnest and the pressure pooling underneath was most likely to release, and her hands weren't shaking, weren't going to shake. Because hands that had performed field thoracotomy with a combat knife in the back of a Black Hawk while shrapnel sang through the fuselage didn't shake for something as simple as a burr hole on a 9-year-old boy who'd been given too many drugs by a doctor in a suit who was stealing from the federal government. The needle went in with a soft pop that only she felt. The hiss of air escaping, no, not air, the rush of cerebrospinal fluid under pressure, the kind of relief that meant the herniation was stopping, the pressure was releasing, the physics of the brain inside a skull coming back into balance. O2 climbing, the nursing tech said, voice shaky. 58. 62. Katie's fingers stayed steady. The secondary needle, the drainage line positioned just right, she'd done this in the dust outside Sanjin Valley with rounds impacting the concrete 3 feet away. She could do this in a climate-controlled pediatric ICU with all the equipment in the world. 70. The tech breathed. 78. 82. Approaching normal. The monitor's frantic beeping slowed to something almost like a rhythm. Almost like a heartbeat that wanted to keep beating. Marcus's color shifted. The bluish tinge around his lips fading back to something almost living. Katie secured the drainage catheter with tape and stepped back, and the room exhaled like a lung that had been holding its breath for 70 hours. "Call neurosurgery back," she said to Castellano, who was staring at her like she'd just landed a helicopter in the middle of his shift. "Tell them he's stable for transfer to the OR. No delays." But that wasn't going to happen. Dr. Pierce arrived at 6:15 a.m., before rounds, before coffee, and found Katie at the nurse's station completing Marcus's procedure notes. He moved toward her with the particular kind of deliberate slowness that men with power use when they've made a decision about how to destroy someone and they want to savor the walk. "You performed an unauthorized surgical procedure," he said. His voice was quiet. Quiet was worse than shouting. Katie didn't look up from the notes. Burr-hole decompression. Child was herniating. Resident couldn't manage it. That decision wasn't yours to make. Neither was oversedating him for 4 days on medications that don't match his injury profile. She turned a page. Her handwriting was perfect, steady, everything documented, everything defensible. Also wasn't your decision to make. That's the thing about federal healthcare fraud. Lots of decisions that weren't supposed to be made. The temperature in the hallway dropped maybe 2 degrees. Pierce's jaw clenched once, twice, and then he turned on his heel and walked away. The termination letter came at 8:36 a.m., delivered by Administrator Chen with the kind of professional distance that meant someone higher up had already signed off, already made the calculations, already decided Katie Rodriguez was worth less than the liability she represented. "Performance unacceptable," Chen read from the letter. "Scope of practice exceeded. Patient safety risk. Unauthorized procedures outside your credentials. Effective immediately, your access to Seattle General is terminated. Your nursing license is not revoked, but your employment is." Katie took the envelope. It was still warm from the printer. "There's a severance package," Chen continued, not meeting her eyes. 2 weeks' pay. Health insurance through the end of the month. We'll need your badge and credentials before you leave the building. She didn't argue. Couldn't argue. The mission, the real mission, the one that lived in the patch sewn inside her jacket lining, required silence. Required accepting termination without protest. Required being nobody, nothing, just a nurse who'd overstepped and gotten fired, not a captain in the United States Air Force conducting a classified protective detail on a colonel's family. She pulled the patch out later, standing in her locker before she closed it for the last time. 455th Expeditionary Wing. 4.5 inches of faded embroidery and memories of a place where she'd been someone, where her rank meant something, where the rules made sense because the rules were written in blood and survival and the simple mathematics of keeping people alive under fire. Now she was nobody again. The rain started around 4 p.m., the kind of Seattle rain that didn't fall so much as hang in the air like the city was drowning by degrees. Katie sat on the metal bench at the bus shelter on 6th and Mercy, her cardboard box balanced across her knees. Inside, the cracked mug from the break room with "World's Okayest Nurse" fading in dishwasher-worn letters, a succulent with brown-edged leaves, she'd been forgetting to water it for 6 months, which felt about right, and a photo in a cheap wooden frame. Martinez. Her co-pilot. His grin 3 weeks before the RPG hit the medevac bird and turned him into someone she couldn't identify well enough to send home in a closed casket. Water dripped through a hole in the shelter's plastic panel, steady as a clock. Rain hammered the pavement like applause from a crowd that would never show up. A bus splashed past without stopping, wrong route, wrong destination, wrong everything, and Katie just sat there with the photo and the dead plant and the cracked mug and thought about a 9-year-old boy with her call sign tattooed on his arm. She'd pulled Marcus Webb through mortar fire 2 years ago. Had carried him, small and light and terrified, half a mile through smoke that tasted like copper and burning fuel. Had taken shrapnel meant for his spine. Had watched his father's face when she finally reached the medevac zone and handed the boy over, still breathing, still whole, still alive. Now Marcus was in the ICU with a drainage catheter and a prognosis, and a father who didn't know that the person who'd saved his son's life twice was sitting on a bus bench in the rain with a box of her belongings and exactly 0 next moves. Her phone vibrated. Text from her handler, encrypted app, red flag protocol, Rodriguez. Mission status. She stared at the screen. Thought about typing compromised org identity blown or lost access to primary. Thought about extraction protocols and safe houses and the careful dance of being nobody in a place where you used to be somebody. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. The succulent's last green leaf trembled in the wind coming through the broken panel. Martina smiled from the photo like he knew something she didn't. 3 blocks behind her, Seattle General's lights were coming on as evening shift arrived, as patients were being wheeled into rooms and families were waiting in corridors, and Dr. Pierce was probably in his office right now congratulating himself on solving a problem. She typed, compromised. Lost access. Then deleted it. Typed, will monitor externally. Target family still at risk. Deleted it. Deleted it. She looked at the photo. At the patch sewn inside her jacket lining. At the rain washing down the street toward the hospital 6 blocks behind her, and the boy who would wake up tomorrow and ask for the nurse who'd checked on him every 4 hours like his breathing mattered more than her career, because it had. Katie set the phone down on the bench beside her. The 3 dots appeared in the message thread, disappeared, appeared again as her handler waited for her next move. She picked up the mug instead. Turned it over in her hands. The letters were barely visible now, worn down to pale shadows. Still true though. Still exactly right. Outside the shelter, the rain kept falling, and somewhere in Seattle General, a 9-year-old boy was sleeping off surgery, and his father was sitting in the waiting room finally understanding why a captain with a call sign and a scar on her shoulder had been so worried about keeping his son alive, and Dr. Pierce was closing his laptop in a parking garage, deleting every frame of security footage that showed a nurse moving with military precision through restricted areas, moving with a kind of steady purpose that comes from knowing exactly how to break something and exactly how to fix it. He didn't see the Navy veteran named Torres watching from 20 feet away. Didn't see the hard drive in Torres's prosthetic hand containing every frame he'd just thought he'd erased. Didn't see anything at all except the problem he'd solved by getting rid of the one person who actually knew how to save lives. Katie sat on the bench and watched the rain. The rain hammered the parking lot like a verdict being read. Katie sat on the bench outside Seattle General, her cardboard box balanced on her knee, staring at the cracked mug and wilted succulent beside a photograph of Martinez, her co-pilot who didn't make it home from their last deployment. The photo was creased now, worn from being pulled out and studied on nights when the weight of failure felt heavier than her combat boots. She had saved Marcus twice. And they had fired her for it. Inside the hospital, in a third-floor office that smelled of antiseptic and ambition, something was beginning to break. Hospital HR had run a routine post-termination audit at 6:44 a.m., the kind of bureaucratic box-checking that nobody paid attention to anymore. Standard procedure. Verify severance, confirm benefits transfer, flag any outstanding equipment. Katie's personnel file went into the system like 1,000 others that month. It should have been forgotten by lunch. But Katie's file didn't process normally. Her name triggered a Pentagon security clearance flag embedded in the Defense Department's background verification server, a protocol that only activated for individuals with classified military assignments still pending review. The entire hospital IT system locked down. No error message. No explanation. Just a frozen screen and a phone number at Walter Reed that suddenly started ringing in Administrator Chen's office. She arrived at Dr. Pierce's door at 7:15 a.m., her face the color of someone who had just been told the building was about to be audited by the federal government. Because that's exactly what was about to happen. Dr. Pierce. Her voice was controlled but thin. We need to talk about Captain Rodriguez's personnel file. Pierce looked up from his desk, where he was reviewing pharmaceutical orders for the past quarter. Routine business. Another morning. His face shifted when he saw Chen's expression. What about her? Pentagon security flag. Lock down the entire system. I just got a call from a General Vance at Walter Reed asking why a classified military operative was terminated without proper notification channels. Chen's hands were shaking. Richard, what exactly was your interaction with that nurse? But Pierce was already standing, already moving toward the window, already understanding that something very large and very military had just noticed him. Meanwhile, 3 floors down in the pediatric ICU, Marcus Webb opened his eyes, truly opened them, for the first time in 6 months. His father sat in the visitor's chair, his uniform immaculate despite the 17-hour vigil, his eyes red from a grief he'd been holding locked behind military composure. Colonel James Webb had watched his son stare at nothing for 187 days. He had attended the meetings with 15 different neurologists who all said the same thing: brain death. Locked-in syndrome was impossible. The swelling was too extensive. The damage too catastrophic. Let him go, Colonel. It's the merciful choice. But Colonel Webb knew something those 15 doctors didn't know. He knew that Captain Katie Rodriguez, the woman who had been terminated just 8 hours ago, had recognized something in his son's scans that nobody else could see. And he knew why. She'd seen it before. In the field. In the rubble of Bagram airfield, where she'd pulled a bleeding child from the aftermath of a mortar strike and kept him breathing all the way to the medevac helicopter. Marcus's hand moved. Slow. Deliberate. His fingers found his father's wrist. Dad. His voice came out like gravel being crushed. Hoarse. Fragile. But unmistakably awake. Dad. Colonel Webb's breath caught. 17 hours became 6 months, became every second of his son's life rewinding into focus. Marcus. Baby. I'm here. I'm right here. But Marcus wasn't looking at his father. His eyes were searching the room, moving across the monitors, the 4 stands, the sterile white walls. Looking for someone. Waiting for someone. His lips moved. Words forming slowly, like he was pulling them up from somewhere very deep and very dark. Shadowbird. The name hung in the room like a bell that had just been struck. Colonel Webb went rigid. His jaw clenched. He knew that name. He had seen it tattooed on his son's forearm in tiny letters 2 years ago, right after the Bagram incident, with instructions from Katie that he keep it covered with long sleeves. A call sign. A promise. A secret between a soldier and a child who had almost died. Colonel Webb stood up. And he walked out of that room with a clarity of purpose that made the fluorescent light seem to dim. At 7:43 a.m., a Marine liaison entered the pediatric ICU with a file folder and a bearing that made nurses scatter like water from a stone. He moved directly to Marcus Webb's room where Colonel Webb was standing, his posture now military rigid, his expression the kind of calm that comes from someone who had just decided exactly how this day was going to unfold. Colonel Webb. The Marine saluted. I have a citation to read. It's being filed as of 0700 hours this morning. The Marine opened the folder. His voice carried through the hospital corridors with the weight of official record. Captain Katie Rodriguez, United States Air Force, 455th Expeditionary Wing. Citation for Valor. For extraordinary heroism under fire at Bagram Airfield on the date of September 14, 2 years ago. During a coordinated mortar attack on forward operating base operations, while performing her duties as a flight surgeon and combat medic, Captain Rodriguez exposed herself to direct enemy fire to extract a wounded non-combatant child from active fire zone. She administered emergency trauma care under hostile conditions, established airway management with field expedient equipment, and maintained patient viability throughout helicopter extraction despite blast injuries and hemorrhagic shock. Her actions directly prevented loss of life and exemplified the highest standards of military valor and service. The Marine paused. Folded the citation. She's being formally recognized at 1,600 hours. And that's when the doors opened and General Harold Vance walked into the hospital like someone who had just decided to make an example out of something. 2-star General. Commandant of the Medical Command at Walter Reed. 34 years of service. The kind of presence that made colonels straighten their uniforms. He walked directly to Marcus Webb's room, took in the scene, the child awake, the father standing like a sentry, the monitor showing a steady rhythm that hadn't been steady in 6 months, and something in his jaw shifted. General Vance moved to Dr. Pierce's office. Knocked once. Entered without waiting. Pierce was on his phone. Something about medication reconciliation. Something about a misunderstanding. The phone fell to his desk when he saw the 2 stars on the general's shoulders. Dr. Pierce. Vance's voice was quiet. Absolutely quiet. I've just reviewed a medical file. I've examined security footage. And I've had a conversation with Captain Rodriguez's handler about a classified assignment that was terminated without proper channels. He set a file on the desk. Explain to me why your pharmaceutical orders for this unit are running at 340% above the standard baseline for pediatric sedation protocols. Pierce's face drained of all color. Completely. Like someone had turned off the blood flow to his head. There's been 16 months, Vance continued, his voice steady as a surgical laser. Inflated medication orders. All from the same supplier. All approved by you personally. And I'm looking at hospital IT records showing that at 2:37 a.m. this morning, you attempted to delete security footage from the ICU. He leaned forward. Security footage of Captain Rodriguez performing an emergency burr-hole procedure to save your patient's life. Through the office window, Torres, a Navy corpsman working the morning shift, stood with a hard drive in his hands. Federal auditors in dark suits were already setting up on the second floor, briefcases filled with subpoenas and billing records. The kind of attention that only comes when the Department of Defense decides something matters enough to send people. She was going to ruin everything, Pierce said quietly, like he was explaining something simple. Like he wasn't watching his life collapse in real time. If she kept pushing, if she kept questioning the orders, the whole program. What program? Vance's voice cut like a blade. You mean the kickback scheme with the pharmaceutical supplier? The one where you've been billing Tricare for unnecessary medications and splitting the savings with the vendor? That program? Pierce's legs gave out. He sat on the floor, just sat down, his back against the wall like gravity had suddenly become too much to fight against. Dr. Richard Pierce, an FBI agent, said from the doorway, badge displayed, "You're under arrest for fraud against the United States military healthcare system. You have the right to remain silent." And as they led Pierce down the hallway, as they cuffed him, Katie stood by the nurse's station in her civilian clothes, her cardboard box sitting on the counter next to a stack of charts, watching the man who had tried to destroy her being led away by federal agents. Their eyes met for one moment. Just one. And Katie took one measured breath, steady and controlled, and let one tear escape. Just one. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. "You should have just let me help him," she said quietly. Pierce opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The agents led him away. General Vance appeared beside Katie. Looked at her the way commanders look at soldiers who have proven themselves in the hardest possible way. "Captain Rodriguez. Your termination is being rescinded effective immediately. You're reinstated with full military honors acknowledged. Your medical record will reflect a commendation from the Office of the Surgeon General for field medicine competency that likely saved your patient's life." Katie didn't salute. "Not yet. Sir. With respect. I need to see my patient." "Go," Vance said. She walked into Marcus Webb's room and the boy smiled, actually smiled, for the first time in 6 months. His eyes focused on her face. Recognized her. Remembered her. "Shadowbird," he whispered. Katie crossed to his bedside and sat down, and this time her hands didn't shake, because they belonged to someone who had just been allowed to be exactly who she was. 6 months later, the pediatric ICU ran like a well-maintained aircraft. No bloat in the prescription orders. No kickback schemes. No pharmaceutical corruption hidden behind over-sedation protocols. Seattle General had a new director for the unit, someone who actually listened when nurses spoke about their patients. Marcus Webb sat propped in his hospital bed, his speech still slow but clear now, his motor control returning a little more each week. Katie adjusted his pillows, and now she wore her scrubs with the 455th Expeditionary Wing patch openly displayed on her sleeve. No more hiding it in jacket linings. No more checking it in bathrooms before her shift. The patch was part of her uniform. Part of her identity. Part of the story that the hospital finally knew. Again, Marcus said, pointing at the patch with fingers that had regained most of their strength. Tell it again. Colonel Webb, sitting in the visitor's chair, smiled. Katie had told this story 40 times. 100 times maybe. But she settled back in her chair, the kind of settling that soldiers do when they're about to tell the truth. We were taking mortar fire, she said. Heavy caliber. Incoming from the North Sector. I was doing a medical check on the base, routine walkthrough, when the first round hit the motor pool. And you ran toward the sound, Marcus interrupted, grinning at the familiar moment. Even though the mortars, Katie confirmed. Because that's what we do. We run toward the people who need help. And I heard you crying. From under the rubble. Just your voice, calling for your dad. Marcus reached out and traced the letters of the patch with his small finger. The letters that represented his father's wing. The emblem that Katie had been carrying all this time. And you saved me, Marcus whispered. Every single time, Katie said. That's what the patch means. It means we don't leave people behind. Through the window of the ICU, Seattle sprawled under a clear sky. Somewhere across the city, in a community college basement classroom, Richard Pierce stood in front of 19 bored students, demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy. His hand shook. His voice was thin. Someone in the back row whispered his name. Recognition dawning. He pretended not to hear and continued pressing on the dummy's chest, performing the motions of saving lives while knowing he had spent his career destroying them. But at Seattle General, Katie pulled out her phone and read a message from her handler, mission complete. Threat neutralized. Reassignment available. She looked at Marcus, at Colonel Webb standing at attention, at the faded patch on her sleeve that still smelled like bagram dust even after all these years. She typed, request extended assignment. This mission isn't finished. Because some assignments don't end with paperwork. Some assignments end with a child learning to speak again. With a father and son reconnecting. With a nurse who carried two identities finally being able to carry them both openly. Katie clipped her badge to her scrubs, both titles, both missions, both parts of who she was, and walked back to Marcus's room where her next shift was waiting. Where the real work, the work that no ranking general could measure or evaluate, was just beginning. If you made it this far, you know there are heroes walking among us right now. Some wear uniforms. Some wear scrubs. Some do both. Subscribe for more stories about the people who give everything so we can sleep safely. And leave a comment, tell me, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?